In 1879, the state of Tennessee did something it had never done before and has never done since. It revoked the charter of its largest city. Memphis simply ceased to exist as a legal municipality. The population had been around 48,000. After the yellow fever finished, and after the people who could afford to leave had left, the count was closer to 14,000. The city owed somewhere between $4 and $6 million it could not pay. The legislature reduced it to something called the taxing district of Shelby County, a kind of administrative ward of the state, stripped of home rule, forbidden from taking on new debt. For 14 years, the place that had been the biggest inland cotton market in the United States operated without a mayor, without a city council, without the legal right to call itself a city. And the strange part, the part that makes the story worth telling, is that this humiliation may have been the best thing that ever happened to Memphis. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The bluff itself is the beginning. The fourth Chickasaw Bluff rises about 60 feet above the Mississippi, high enough that the river has never topped it, not once in recorded history. Every other stretch of lowland for hundreds of miles floods. The bluff doesn't. The Chickasaw knew this. The Spanish knew it. They built Fort San Fernando there in 1795. The French had been interested even earlier. It's one of those places where geography writes the first chapter of the story and then keeps rewriting it for 200 years. In 1818, Andrew Jackson, not yet president, not yet even the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the popular imagination that would later harden around him, negotiated the purchase of western Tennessee from the Chickasaw Nation. It was called the Jackson Purchase, and it opened millions of acres for settlement. Less than 5 months later, on May 22, 1819, Jackson and two partners, John Overton and James Winchester, founded a city on the bluff and named it Memphis, after the ancient capital of Egypt, which sat at the head of the Nile Delta. They were investors, all three of them, land speculators with political connections, and they understood that whoever controlled the crossing point of the lower Mississippi controlled a choke point of American commerce. They laid out a grid of streets interrupted by 4 public squares: Exchange, Market, Court, and Auction. Those names tell you everything about what they expected this place to become. For 2 decades, it almost didn't. A sandbar choked the river approach. A national economic depression dampened investment. The county seat went to nearby Raleigh, which stung. Flatboatmen raised hell on the waterfront, giving Memphis a reputation that discouraged the kind of capital that builds lasting institutions. By 1840, the population was still fewer than 1,800. That's smaller than a lot of county seats today. Then the 1840s changed everything. Northern Mississippi opened to settlement, doubling the agricultural hinterland that Memphis could serve. The city became a post and stagecoach terminus. 6 miles of railroad track were laid eastward. Just 6, but it was a start. Randolph, the rival town upstream, lost its river access when a mile-wide sandbar developed. And Memphis, sitting on its stubborn bluff, watched its only serious competitor disappear. By 1850, the population had passed 6,000. By 1858, it was 22,000. Memphis was growing faster than any other American city in the mid-1850s. The reason was cotton, and the reason was the river. Cotton came downriver from the plantations of West Tennessee and northern Mississippi on flatboats and steamboats, piled in bales on the cobblestones of the Memphis Landing, and from there it went to New Orleans, to Liverpool, to the textile mills of Manchester. Memphis positioned itself as the middleman, the place where cotton factors, those crucial financial intermediaries, set up shop. A cotton factor advanced money to planters, arranged the sale of their crop, and took a percentage. It was banking and brokerage and commodity trading wrapped into one profession, and Memphis became the headquarters for hundreds of them. By the eve of the Civil War, Memphis was shipping over 360,000 bales of cotton a year and claiming close to 10% of the entire American cotton market. The Irish arrived first among the immigrants, refugees from the famine, working the docks and the construction sites. By 1860, the Irish made up more than 23% of the white population. The Germans came next, more urban, more propertied, opening shops and small factories, furnishing the city's musicians and teachers. They brought beer gardens and a civic sensibility that had been absent from a town built on speculation and river trade. And along the waterfront, Robertson Topp, the same developer who had laid out Beale Street in 1841, naming it for a forgotten Mexican war hero, was building something that announced Memphis had arrived. The Gaioso House opened in 1842, and nothing like it existed for 500 miles in any direction. Topp had hired James Dakin, a founder of the American Institute of Architects, to design it, and the result was a Greek Revival hotel with a portico visible from the river, its own waterworks, its own gasworks, its own bakery and wine cellar and sewer system, amenities that the rest of Memphis emphatically did not possess. The cost was $144,000, an astonishing sum for a frontier town that still had dirt streets and plank sidewalks. The indoor plumbing featured marble bathtubs and silver faucets. Guests arriving by steamboat stepped from the hotel's private wharf onto a red carpet. In the late 1850s, Topp doubled the hotel's size, adding another 100 rooms designed by the firm of Isaiah Rogers, the same architect who had built the Tremont House in Boston, the first truly modern hotel in America. The Gaioso House was Memphis saying, "We are not a river landing anymore. We are a city." Then came the war, and then came the fever. The Civil War treated Memphis relatively gently, as wars go. The Union Navy took the city in a 2-hour river battle on June 6, 1862, and it remained under federal occupation for the duration. Memphis wasn't burned, it wasn't besieged. It even prospered in its way on contraband cotton trade that flowed through the occupied city with a wink and a nod from officers on both sides. The real catastrophe was biological. Yellow fever had visited Memphis before, in 1828, in 1855, in 1867. But the epidemics of the 1870s were something else entirely. In 1873, about 2,000 people died, the highest yellow fever toll of any inland American city at that time. Then came 1878. The conditions were perfect. A mild winter, a long spring, a ferocious summer that bred the Aedes aegypti mosquito in the open sewers, the stagnant bayous, the rainwater cisterns that dotted every neighborhood. Nobody understood that mosquitoes were the vector. The prevailing theory blamed bad air, miasma, filth. On August 13, 1878, a restaurant owner named Kate Bionda became the first confirmed death in the city proper. Within 2 weeks, roughly 25,000 people, more than half the population, had fled. They left doors open, valuables sitting on tables. Some cities along the escape routes set up armed barricades to keep the refugees out. Of the 19,000 who stayed, most were too poor to leave. 17,000 of them contracted the fever. 5,150 died. At its peak, the death toll reached 200 a day. Catholic and Episcopalian nuns and priests stayed to tend the sick, and many of them died doing it. The madam of a local brothel, Annie Cook, converted her establishment into a makeshift hospital and nursed patients until she herself succumbed. The first frost came on October 18th and killed the mosquitoes. The epidemic was declared over. And Memphis was finished, or so it seemed. The financial losses exceeded $15 million. The city was bankrupt. The Irish and German communities, which had given Memphis its cosmopolitan edge, were devastated and would never fully recover. When another, smaller epidemic hit in 1879, the state legislature revoked the charter. Memphis became the taxing district of Shelby County, governed by commissioners appointed from Nashville, forbidden from borrowing, ordered to pay down its debts. It was, in effect, receivership. But here's where the story turns, and this is the part that matters for everything that comes after. The taxing district, precisely because it was so constrained, practiced a kind of enforced fiscal discipline that the old city government never had. The debts were repaid, the tax base was restructured, and the leaders who emerged from the wreckage did two things that would define modern Memphis. First, they built a sewer system. A group of Memphians met in St. Louis in 1879, determined that the filth of the city, whatever its actual relationship to yellow fever, had to be addressed. They hired engineers and designed a comprehensive sanitary infrastructure. It was one of the most ambitious public health undertakings any American city had attempted, and it worked. Cholera, dysentery, and yellow fever retreated. Second, in 1887, someone drilled deep enough to find what lay beneath the city, a massive aquifer of artesian water, abundant and spectacularly pure. Memphis was sitting on top of one of the finest natural water supplies in the world, and nobody had known it. That discovery guaranteed the city's water supply, eliminated the need for the muddy Wolf River water that residents had always despised, and removed one of the fundamental anxieties that had haunted Memphis since its founding. The water was so clean, so naturally filtered through hundreds of feet of sand, that Memphis would eventually become one of the only major American cities that didn't need to chemically treat its drinking water. It still doesn't. With clean water underground and clean sewers above, Memphis had what it needed to grow. The state restored home rule in 1893, and the city recharged itself with the ferocity of a place that had been given a second chance. The bridge came first. Since the founding, Memphis had looked across the Mississippi at Arkansas and seen commerce it couldn't easily reach. Every railroad car crossing the river had to be loaded onto a ferry, floated across, and unloaded on the other side. In 1884, two railroad companies petitioned Congress for permission to build a bridge, and the project was entrusted to George S. Morrison, one of the premier engineers of the age. No bridge had ever been attempted on the lower Mississippi. The river was too wide, the current too strong, the bottom too deep and unstable. Morrison's piers went nearly 100 feet below the water's surface. The bridge was built entirely of open hearth steel, a material so new that it was still considered experimental. When the great bridge at Memphis opened on May 12, 1892, it was the first bridge to span the Mississippi south of St. Louis, the third longest bridge in the world, and it had cost nearly $3 million. 50,000 Memphians jammed the riverfront for the celebration. 18 locomotives from every railroad company operating out of Memphis lined up for the first crossing, and cannons fired as they rolled across. Memphis had 9 major rail lines converging on it. By the early 1900s, it would have 11 trunk lines. Cotton Row, the stretch of Front Street where the factors had their offices, was now connected by steel and rail to the entire continent. And the city was building. By 1900, the population had passed 100,000, a 4-fold increase from the yellow fever nadir just 2 decades earlier. Technology was remaking the landscape. Electric streetlights, trolley lines, the first skyscrapers, the telephone. The Gaioso House, the grand hotel that had defined Memphis for nearly 60 years, burned on the 4th of July, 1899. It was rebuilt almost immediately, this time in a U-shaped design by James B. Cook, the same architect who had supervised the 1850s expansion. The new Gaioso surrounded a courtyard screened from Front Street by a row of columns, and its dining room featured murals by Newton Alonzo Wells depicting Hernando de Soto's arrival at the bluff. The hotel would operate for another half-century, but its primacy was about to be challenged. Cotton was still king, but Memphis was diversifying. The hardwood lumber industry had discovered the vast forests of the Mississippi Delta and the bottomlands of West Tennessee and Arkansas. Massive rafts of timber floated down the river to Memphis, and new railroads penetrated the virgin woods to bring even more. By 1910, 32 hardwood mills were operating in the city, and Memphis was calling itself the hardwood capital of the world. Furniture makers from across the country bought their wood here. Cottonseed processing became another major industry. Memphis led the nation in the manufacture of cottonseed oil, which was used in everything from cooking to soap. And then there were the mules. Into the 1950s, Memphis was the world's largest mule market, because mules were still how you moved cotton bales from the riverbank up the bluff to the warehouses. The cobblestone landing, laid by immigrant laborers between the 1850s and 1890s, with stones quarried in Illinois, an estimated 800,000 of them, was worn smooth by hooves and iron-rimmed wheels. In 1909, a young bookkeeper from Holly Springs, Mississippi, named Edward Hull Crump, won the mayor's office. Crump had come to Memphis at 17, married the daughter of a wealthy merchant, bought the carriage manufacturing firm where he worked, and developed a genius for understanding what people wanted. He ran on a reform platform: efficient government, lower taxes, cleaner streets, and he delivered. He also refused to enforce prohibition, which had become state law in Tennessee, and when the governor pushed an ouster law in 1915, Crump resigned just ahead of court action. He presented himself as a victim of power company conspiracies, and Memphians believed him. For the next 4 decades, Crump controlled Memphis politics absolutely, selecting every mayor, every city councilman, and most of the state's governors and senators, all from his insurance office at the corner of Main and Adams. Time magazine would call him in 1946 the most absolute political boss in the United States. Between 1928 and 1948, the Crump machine did not lose a single election it contested at any level. Say what you will about Boss Crump, and there is plenty to say, but the city worked under his rule. Streets were swept, trash was collected, utilities were consolidated under public ownership, saving ratepayers money. New Deal dollars flowed in during the Depression: public buildings, public housing, infrastructure improvements. Memphis in the 1930s and 1940s was clean, orderly, and tightly controlled. It was also, of course, rigidly segregated, and the order Crump maintained depended on a racial bargain that allowed black Memphians to vote, unusual in the Jim Crow South, in exchange for their loyalty to his machine. But that bargain produced something remarkable on Beale Street. After the yellow fever emptied Memphis, a formerly enslaved man named Robert Church had bought land around Beale at rock-bottom prices. It proved to be one of the shrewdest real estate investments in the history of the American South. Church became the first black millionaire from the former Confederacy. In 1899, he paid for the city to create Church Park at the corner of 4th and Beale, with an auditorium that seated 2,000 people. President Theodore Roosevelt spoke there in 1902, addressing 10,000 people. Booker T. Washington spoke there. Franklin Roosevelt spoke there. The city's first black-owned bank opened next door in 1906. And then came the music. In 1903, a trumpet player from Clarksdale, Mississippi, named W.C. Handy, arrived in Memphis, recruited by a local mayor to lead a band. Handy was college-educated, a trained musician who could read and write music at a time when the blues existed mostly as an oral tradition among rural black musicians in the Delta. He listened to what he heard on Beale Street: the field hollers, the work songs, the raw 12-bar patterns, and he wrote it down. In 1909, he composed a campaign song for Boss Crump called Mr. Crump, which became the Memphis Blues. In 1916, he wrote Beale Street Blues, "I'd rather be here than anywhere I know," and the song traveled on sheet music and phonograph records across the country, putting Beale Street and Memphis on the map of American culture in a way that cotton and lumber never had. Beale Street between Main and Lauderdale, those 8 blocks, became the center of black commercial and cultural life for the entire Mid-South. Department stores, tailoring shops, grocery stores, funeral parlors, juke joints, the Daisy Theater, the Palace. Ida B. Wells published the Memphis Free Speech from a building on Beale. The Lincoln Republican League operated out of offices at 392 Beale. It was a street where you could buy a suit, get your teeth fixed, hear the best music in the country, and organize a voter registration drive, all within walking distance. In the 1920s through the 1940s, Louis Armstrong, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Memphis Minnie, and Albert King all played Beale Street. B.B. King had marketed himself as Riley Beale Street Blues Boy King before shortening it. If you were an aspiring black musician anywhere in the South in the late 1940s and 1950s, Beale Street was your destination the way Hollywood was for aspiring actors. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Memphis was raising the building that would come to define it. The original Peabody Hotel had opened in 1869 at Main and Monroe, built by Colonel Robert Campbell Brinkley and named for the philanthropist George Peabody. It immediately became the social hub of the city. Presidents Andrew Johnson and William McKinley signed the guest register. It survived the Panic of 1873, the Yellow Fever, a partial building collapse, and a fire before closing in 1923. But the owners had already planned something grander. The new Peabody opened on September 1st, 1925, at the corner of 2nd Street and Union Avenue. The architect was Walter Alschlager of Chicago, and he designed a 12-story Italian Renaissance Revival skyscraper that cost $5 million, the equivalent of about $87 million today. The lobby soared 2 stories high, framed in travertine marble, capped by a stained glass skylight. A fountain carved from a single block of Italian travertine sat at its center. The Skyway Ballroom on the top floor offered views of the river and became one of only a handful of venues in America from which CBS broadcast live radio programs during the big band era. Tommy Dorsey played there. The Andrews Sisters played there. In a city that was still, in many ways, a cotton and lumber town, the Peabody was a declaration that Memphis could hold its own with Chicago and New York, at least for an evening. Then, in 1933, the hotel's general manager, Frank Shutt, came back from a weekend duck hunting trip in Arkansas, and, perhaps after a drink or two, placed his live English call ducks in the lobby fountain as a joke. The guests loved it. The ducks stayed. In 1940, a bellman named Edward Pembroke, who happened to be a former circus animal trainer, volunteered to train the ducks to march to and from the fountain on a red carpet to the strains of John Philip Sousa's King Cotton March. The Peabody Duck March has happened twice a day, 11 in the morning, 5 in the afternoon, every day since. It is, by any measure, the most successful piece of improvisational hotel marketing in American history. The same decade that gave Memphis the new Peabody also gave it one of its most American stories. In 1916, a man named Clarence Saunders opened a grocery store at 79 Jefferson Street and called it Piggly Wiggly. Before Saunders, you walked into a grocery store, handed a list to a clerk behind a counter, and waited while he gathered your items. Saunders eliminated the clerk. He put the merchandise on open shelves, gave customers baskets, and let them serve themselves. He invented checkout lanes. He invented price tags on individual items. He invented, in other words, the modern supermarket. Within 5 years, Piggly Wiggly had over 1,200 stores across the country. Saunders became enormously wealthy and began building a mansion in East Memphis, 36,500 square feet, faced with pink Georgia marble that Memphians immediately dubbed the Pink Palace. He planned a lake, a golf course, a shooting range, a bowling alley. The architect, Hubert McGee, described the style as Romanesque American rambling design, which is a generous way of saying Saunders built exactly what he wanted. In 1923, Saunders lost a vicious battle with Wall Street short sellers over control of Piggly Wiggly stock. He was forced into bankruptcy. He spent over $1 million on the mansion and never lived in it. The land was sold to developers. The unfinished house was donated to the city, which turned it into a museum that opened in 1930 as the Memphis Museum of Natural History and Industrial Arts. Everyone still called it the Pink Palace, and eventually the museum gave up and adopted the name officially. Today, it's the largest museum in the Southeast, and there's a replica of the original Piggly Wiggly store inside, a monument to the man who changed how every American buys groceries and couldn't hold on to the fortune it made him. By the 1940s and 1950s, Memphis was humming. The population had reached nearly 400,000. The Cotton Carnival, a citywide celebration inaugurated in 1931, drew visitors from across the region. The municipal airport, completed in 1929, was growing. The Memphis Defense Depot and a German prisoner of war camp had brought wartime industry and federal spending. The city joined the Tennessee Valley Authority electric system in 1934, giving it access to cheap public power. Under boss Crump, who died in 1954, Memphis was routinely named the cleanest, quietest, safest city in the country. You can see the photographs from those years. Main Street packed with shoppers, the trolleys running, Goldsmith's department store doing brisk business at the old Gaioso Hotel, which the store had purchased in 1948 for offices and storage. The Orpheum Theater, originally the Grand Opera House when it opened in 1890 and rebuilt after a fire in 1928 as a lavish movie palace, was drawing crowds every Saturday night. The cobblestones along the river were still being trod by mules. And on a quiet stretch of McLemore Avenue in South Memphis in 1957, a fiddle player named Jim Stewart and his sister Estelle Axton converted an old movie theater into a recording studio. They called it Satellite Records, then changed the name to Stax, the first two letters of each of their last names. The studio was surprisingly integrated for its time, recording black and white musicians together, and the house band, Booker T and the MGs, two black members, two white, became the backbone of a sound that would define an era. Otis Redding recorded Sitting on the Dock of the Bay there. Sam and Dave recorded Hold On, I'm Coming. Isaac Hayes, the Bar-Kays, Rufus and Carla Thomas, Albert King. The list of artists who walked through that converted movie theater reads like a syllabus of American music history. A few miles away at 706 Union Avenue, Sam Phillips had already changed the world. Phillips opened the Memphis Recording Service in 1950 and Sun Studio shortly after, and he recorded B.B. King and Howlin' Wolf before a 19-year-old truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi, walked in and paid $4 to cut a record for his mother. On July 5, 1954, Elvis Presley recorded That's All Right, Mama at Sun Studio, and disc jockey Dewey Phillips, no relation to Sam, played it on WHBQ radio that night, over and over, until teenagers across Memphis were in a frenzy. Phillips hauled the kid out of a movie theater for his first ever radio interview. Elvis signed his RCA contract on Peabody Hotel letterhead. He held his high school prom in the Continental Ballroom. He bought his clothes from Bernard Lansky's shop on Beale Street, where Lansky, the clothier to the king, had told the broke young singer not to worry about money. Just buy from me. Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison, they all came through Sun Studio, all discovered by Phillips. A record producer in a small building on Union Avenue, working with musicians who had walked up from the Delta, launched an art form that conquered the planet. In 1952, a Memphis businessman named Kemmons Wilson drove his family to Washington, D.C. for vacation, and was so appalled by the roadside motels, the inconsistent quality, the extra charges for children, that he came home and built his own. The first Holiday Inn went up on Summer Avenue, the main highway to Nashville, and Wilson's model of standardized, family-friendly, affordable lodging became the first national motel chain. At its peak, Holiday Inns had over 300,000 rooms worldwide. Memphis kept producing these outsized American originals: Saunders, Phillips, Wilson, entrepreneurs who saw a gap between how things were done and how they could be done, and built empires from the difference. But the seeds of decline were already planted, even in the flush years. The dependency on cotton was real. When synthetic fibers and global competition began eroding the market, Memphis had less to fall back on than it thought. The hardwood lumber industry was mature, and the virgin forests that had fed it were largely gone. The mule market, once a source of genuine wealth, was an anachronism by the time tractors finished their conquest of southern agriculture. And the city's racial order, which had been maintained by a combination of Crump's machine politics and Jim Crow custom, was about to crack open. It started with the sanitation workers. In February 1968, two black sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death when a malfunctioning garbage truck's compactor activated while they were sheltering from rain in the back. The city's black sanitation workers went on strike, 1,300 men, demanding better equipment, better pay, and basic recognition of their humanity. They marched through downtown carrying signs that read, "I am a man." The strike drew national attention and brought Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis. On April 4, 1968, standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, King was killed by a sniper's bullet. The assassination accelerated forces that were already in motion. Riots broke out. National Guard troops with bayonets blocked Beale Street. White residents, many of whom had already been moving to the suburbs, accelerated their departure. In 1970, the Census Bureau reported Memphis as 60% white. A federal court order in 1973 mandated busing to integrate the public schools, and within 4 years, roughly 40,000 of the system's 71,000 white students had left, for private schools, for the suburbs, for other cities entirely. The tax base hemorrhaged. Downtown, the businesses began to close. The Peabody went first, or near enough. Deeply in debt by the early 1960s, sold in a foreclosure auction to Sheraton Hotels in 1965, it limped along as the Sheraton Peabody until December 1973, when it closed altogether. The ducks went home. The stained glass skylight gathered dust. The travertine fountain sat dry. A few blocks away, the city's urban renewal program, launched with federal money and the best of intentions, was demolishing entire neighborhoods. In the 151-acre Beale Street 1 area, the Memphis Housing Authority tore down 560 buildings between 1969 and 1973. Over 1,500 residents were displaced. The grand old Lowe's State Theater was demolished. Block after block became unpaved parking lots. People who stood outside the Orpheum Theater in the mid-1970s described the view as looking like bombed-out Berlin. Beale Street was fenced off from 1977 to 1983. The only business that stayed open through the desolation was A. Schwab, a dry goods store that had operated on Beale since 1876. Stax Records, which had been one of the largest black-owned businesses in America, went bankrupt in 1975. The building on McLemore Avenue was demolished in 1989. The lot sat empty, covered in broken glass and whiskey bottles. Al Bell, the former Stax executive who had helped build the label into a powerhouse, would park across the street and weep. The population peaked around 2000 at 690,000. By the 2020 census, it had fallen to 628,000, a drop of nearly 10%, and the most recent estimates put it lower still, around 602,000. Nashville, once smaller, has long since surpassed Memphis and shows no sign of slowing down. But decay in Memphis was never a single dramatic collapse. It was a store closing on Main Street, a streetcar line shutting down, a population figure dropping in one census, then the next, then the next. The Gaioso Hotel, which had been the finest address on the river in 1842, was bought by Goldsmith's department store in 1948 and used for storage. The cobblestones along the landing, those 800,000 stones laid by immigrant hands, sloughed and settled and fell into disrepair. The cotton warehouses along Front Street emptied out as the commodity that had built the city moved to other markets or simply mattered less. There were rescues. The Bells family bought the shuttered Peabody in 1975, poured $25 million into a 6-year renovation, and reopened it in 1981. The ducks came back. The fountain refilled. The skyway gleamed again. The reopening is widely credited with sparking the downtown revitalization that has continued fitfully ever since. The Orpheum Theater, which came within a whisker of demolition, was purchased in 1976 by a group of citizens who formed the Memphis Development Foundation, and $5 million later, it was restored to its 1928 grandeur, hosting Broadway touring productions. Beale Street reopened in 1983 as an entertainment district, the neon and the live music returning to a corridor that had been fenced and silent for 6 years. A replica of the Stax studio was built on the original site in 2003, housing a museum and a music academy. And in 1971, a 27-year-old ex-Marine named Frederick W. Smith, working from a hangar at Memphis International Airport, launched Federal Express with a fleet of 14 small aircraft delivering packages overnight to 25 cities. Smith had written the business plan as a term paper at Yale. Legend says he got a C on it, though Smith himself has been cagey about the grade. Today, FedEx is the largest cargo airline in the world. Its super hub at Memphis International makes the airport one of the busiest cargo facilities on Earth, and the company employs over 30,000 people in the Memphis area. It is, by a wide margin, the city's largest employer and the single most important economic engine that Memphis has. The fact that an entire city's economic future can hinge so heavily on one company is a thought that keeps some people up at night. But it is also the kind of audacious, all-in bet that Memphis has always made, going back to the men who decided to build a city on a bluff above a river that flooded everything except the spot they were standing on. The cobblestones are still there, along the riverfront between Beale and Jefferson, 80% of them original. The National Register of Historic Places listed them in 1979, though restoration didn't begin until the 1990s. You can walk down to the Mississippi on those stones and feel the grooves worn by 150 years of hooves and wheels and boots. The river is still there, of course, wide and brown and indifferent. The Frisco Bridge, Morrison's masterpiece from 1892, still carries railroad traffic. The Peabody ducks still march at 11 and 5. The bluff still doesn't flood. At 79 Jefferson Street, where Clarence Saunders opened the first Piggly Wiggly in 1916 and changed American retail forever, there is nothing in particular. The building is long gone. The Pink Palace, his unfinished dream, sits 3 miles east on Central Avenue, full of school children and dinosaur fossils, and a replica of the store that made him rich and couldn't keep him that way. On Macklemore Avenue, the Stax Museum stands where the old movie theater stood, and inside you can see a recreation of Studio A, the room where Otis Redding and Isaac Hayes and Booker T. Jones made music that still sounds like nothing else. Sun Studio is open for tours at 706 Union. The Lorraine Motel is the National Civil Rights Museum now. The Gaioso is apartments. Memphis sits on its bluff in the late afternoon light, the river below catching the sun the way it did when the Chickasaw camped here, when DeSoto's men stood on the bank and looked across, when Andrew Jackson and his partners drove stakes into the ground and gave the place a name borrowed from a civilization 5,000 years older and 6,000 miles away. The water beneath the city is still pure. The door is still open.